The challenge begins. It was a bright, calm afternoon in a quiet suburban park. Birds chirped in the trees, families gathered by picnic tables, and an elderly man named Isaiah sat alone on a bench near the pond, quietly reading his book. His peaceful, unassuming appearance blended in with the serene landscape. A simple gray jacket, faded jeans, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. Isaiah looked like any other elderly man content in his solitude. Isaiah had chosen this spot for its tranquility, the kind of place where he could escape the world's noise. Little did he know, however, that his peace would soon be disrupted. Across the playground, a group of teenage boys gathered, bored and looking for excitement. They were the type to find amusement in mischief and, unfortunately, often in bothering others. These weren't troubled kids, but they enjoyed pushing boundaries, testing reactions, and showing off to one another. Among them was Kyle, their unofficial leader. Tall, lean, and with a knack for trouble, Kyle thrived on the attention of his friends. He'd do almost anything to get a laugh, especially if it involved messing with people he deemed easy targets. Kyle spotted Isaiah from across the playground. His eyes narrowed, and a smirk crept onto his face. "Hey guys, look at the old man over there. He looks like he can barely stand up. Let's have some fun," he said, nudging his friends. The group chuckled, exchanging excited glances as they edged closer to the unsuspecting man. As they approached, Isaiah seemed unaware of the impending disturbance. He continued reading, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages with a familiarity that suggested these words were old friends. The boys found this calm irritating. They wanted a reaction, someone who would rise to their taunts. Kyle leaned over, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Grandpa, what's so interesting in that book? You even know how to read, old man." Kyle's words carried a sting, a mocking tone meant to provoke. He crossed his arms and took a stance of defiance, expecting Isaiah to feel belittled, perhaps intimidated. But Isaiah didn't look up. He continued reading, his calm composure undisturbed. He had faced much worse in his life. A few immature remarks wouldn't shake him. To the boys, though, this was infuriating. His silence, his calm, it felt like he was ignoring them. The group's snickering grew louder, and one of the other boys, Derek, chimed in. "Maybe he's deaf. Should we shout a little louder?" He mocked, his laughter cutting through the quiet park. The boys circled around Isaiah, their postures growing bolder. Kyle moved a step closer, determined to get some sort of reaction, even if it meant escalating the situation. Isaiah, though outwardly calm, was keenly aware of their presence. He sensed the aggression simmering beneath their bravado, the restless energy of teenagers who didn't understand the consequences of their actions. He had encountered young men like them before, boys who had yet to learn the lessons life would inevitably teach. Then came the comment that seemed to be the tipping point. "Maybe he doesn't belong here," one of the boys muttered under his breath, his words carrying an unspoken hostility that suggested more than just casual disrespect. Isaiah took a deep breath, letting the comment pass without a reaction. He didn't need to teach them a lesson with anger, but he knew that ignoring the situation completely would only embolden them. For now, he would let them show their true colors. Life had a way of guiding moments like these, and Isaiah was no stranger to life's hidden wisdom. Kyle, sensing he wasn't getting what he wanted, leaned even closer, almost within arm's reach. His face twisted into a sneer as he said, "Think you're too good for us, old man? Or are you just too scared to say anything?" Isaiah turned a page in his book, and without lifting his eyes, replied softly, "There is nothing worth responding to in what you've said, young man." His voice was steady, firm, and undeniably authoritative, carrying a weight the boys hadn't expected. Kyle blinked, taken aback. It wasn't anger or fear in Isaiah's voice, just a calm certainty. This stirred something unfamiliar in the boys, a feeling they couldn't quite place. But Kyle wouldn't let his pride be bruised so easily. "Oh, I get it," he sneered. "He thinks he's some kind of wise old man." He laughed, nudging his friends. Bet he couldn't even get up off that bench if he tried. Isaiah looked up then, his gaze finally meeting Kyle's. His eyes were calm but held a depth that seemed to silence even the wind around them. For a moment, Kyle felt a twinge of discomfort, but his pride kept him from backing down. The tension between them hung heavy in the air as Isaiah closed his book slowly, placing it carefully on the bench beside him. "Young man," Isaiah began, his tone carrying a quiet strength, "it is often the smallest dogs that bark the loudest. I suggest you reconsider your behavior before it leads you somewhere you cannot handle." The boys stared at him, momentarily unsure how to respond. This was not the reaction they had anticipated. Kyle, however, was not about to back down. He puffed out his chest, emboldened by his friend's presence. "Is that supposed to scare me?" he challenged, stepping closer until he was practically towering over Isaiah. "What are you going to do about it, old man?" Isaiah remained seated, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Kyle with a level of patience that seemed unbreakable. He could sense the tension in the boys' stances, the barely contained aggression born from arrogance and ignorance. But he also knew that sometimes words alone could reshape young hearts, even those brimming with misguided confidence. Kyle raised his hand in a threatening gesture, but before he could complete the motion, Isaiah's arm shot up, intercepting Kyle's wrist with surprising speed. The strength in his grip was unmistakable, holding Kyle's hand in midair, rendering him immobile. The other boys froze, their smirks replaced with wide-eyed shock. Isaiah's grip was firm but gentle, a silent reminder that true strength didn't need to be loud or aggressive. He held Kyle's wrist, his calm gaze never wavering. And in that moment, the teenagers realized they had underestimated the man before them. Kyle struggled to pull his hand free, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. But Isaiah's calm demeanor disarmed him completely. Isaiah looked him in the eyes, his voice barely above a whisper, but brimming with the authority of years lived and lessons learned. "You're young," Isaiah said quietly, releasing Kyle's hand, "and there is still time for you to choose a better path. But you must understand that respect and kindness go much further than intimidation and anger." Kyle stepped back, momentarily speechless, his pride wounded but his mind racing. The boys watched in stunned silence, the realization dawning on them that this was no ordinary man. Isaiah's calm presence had revealed more strength than any punch or display of force could have. For the first time, the boys felt something deeper than just shock. They felt respect, perhaps even a sense of awe. The old man they had dismissed as weak and defenseless was something they hadn't expected. A teacher, a person who held more wisdom in his silence than they had in all their bravado. As Isaiah resumed his reading, the boys stood there, unsure of what to do next, the first seeds of doubt beginning to sprout in their minds. The encounter deepens. Kyle and his friends stumbled away from Isaiah, their laughter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The encounter had shaken them, although none would admit it. For a brief moment, they had glimpsed a force beyond their understanding, an authority that couldn't be challenged by the usual bravado or intimidation. Isaiah sat back on his bench, quietly returning to his book, aware of the boys lingering at a distance. He didn't mind their hesitation. In fact, he welcomed it. For Isaiah, a retired martial arts master, life had become a study in patience and humility. He had once thrived in a world of fierce competitions and rigorous training, but as he grew older, his focus had shifted toward finding peace and, above all, teaching lessons that mattered. The boys weren't finished with him, though not by a long shot. Kyle's pride felt bruised, and his friends looked to him, waiting to see if he'd regain his authority. He refused to let an old man get the better of him in front of his friends. With a bitter determination, he turned back to the group. "Let's try again," he muttered. "No old man's gonna make me look like a fool." The other boys nodded, though with a little less confidence than before. They had sensed something different in Isaiah's gaze, something that had unsettled them in ways they couldn't explain. but their loyalty to Kyle and their desire to save face kept them from backing down. Isaiah watched them approach with a knowing gaze. He could see the turmoil in their eyes, the clashing emotions of pride, fear, and insecurity. In his years as a martial artist, and later as a teacher, he had encountered countless young people with the same energy, the same restlessness. He knew the struggles they faced, the pressure to prove themselves, the fear of appearing weak, the desire to belong. He also knew that few things guided them more powerfully than a gentle reminder of the consequences of their choices. The boys gathered around him again, their expressions cautious but determined. This time, they didn't taunt or mock. They simply stood, arms crossed, faces set, waiting for Isaiah to react. Kyle was the first to speak, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it had before. "What, are you too good for us or something?" he challenged, his tone bitter. Isaiah looked up, his gaze calm and steady. "No, young man, I'm not better than you. I'm simply different," he replied. "And difference, if you allow it, can teach you something valuable." The boys exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected him to respond this way, and his words struck a chord, though none of them would admit it. Isaiah continued, closing his book and resting his hands on his knees. "Tell me," he asked, his voice gentle but probing, "why do you feel the need to prove yourselves like this?" The question hung in the air, a mirror to their insecurities. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, the bravado in his eyes dimming slightly. No one had ever asked him that before, and he didn't know how to respond. After a moment of silence, he forced a smirk, deflecting the question with mock indifference. "Why should we answer you? You're just some old guy sitting in a park," he retorted, but his words lacked conviction. Isaiah smiled slightly, recognizing the attempt to hide vulnerability. "An old man, perhaps, but maybe one who understands more about you than you think," he said, his gaze meeting each boy's eyes in turn. Derek, one of Kyle's closest friends, suddenly felt compelled to speak. "What would you know about us?" he challenged, though his voice wavered. "You don't know what it's like growing up now. Everyone expects us to be something, to be tough, to be better than everyone else." Isaiah nodded, understanding more than Derek realized. "I understand far more than you think, young man. I've been in situations where I had to prove myself, where people expected me to fight, to be strong, to never show weakness," he said. "But I learned that true strength lies in knowing when to stand firm and when to let go." The boys stared at him, caught between intrigue and disbelief. Kyle felt something stir within him, a sensation he couldn't quite place. Isaiah's words felt both foreign and familiar, as though they held a truth he had always known but never acknowledged. "Stand firm and let go," Kyle scoffed, trying to regain his tough exterior. "Sounds like some weak philosophy to me. What are you, some kind of retired priest or something?" Isaiah chuckled, his laughter soft but filled with genuine warmth. "No, I'm no priest," he replied. "But I am someone who has learned through years of experience that life is more than proving how tough you are. It's about learning to respect others, and ultimately, yourself." Isaiah stood then, his movements slow and deliberate. His presence seemed to grow, radiating a quiet strength that filled the space around him. He turned to the boys, his face now level with theirs, his gaze steady. "There was a time," he began, "when I believed I had to show everyone how powerful I was. I trained relentlessly, honed my skills, and entered every competition I could find. I won countless matches, defeated strong opponents, and proved myself over and over. But in the end, I discovered that the greatest battles aren't fought with fists." Kyle and his friends listened in silence, the cocky smiles fading from their faces as they absorbed his words. "What do you mean?" asked one of the boys quietly, breaking the tension that hung in the air. Isaiah took a breath, reflecting for a moment. "The hardest battle is often within ourselves. The struggle to understand our own fears, our own pride, our own insecurities," he explained. "It's easy to fight someone else. It's much harder to face the things we don't like about ourselves. Kyle's posture softened slightly, the hardness in his gaze melting into something closer to understanding. Deep down, he knew Isaiah was right. He had spent years fighting others, proving himself, masking the doubts and insecurities he carried. But hearing this truth spoken out loud felt strangely comforting, like a release he hadn't known he needed. Seeing their expressions shift, Isaiah felt a spark of hope. He knew they weren't bad kids. They were just lost, searching for identity in a world that often demanded they wear masks of toughness and indifference. He reached out a hand, placing it gently on Kyle's shoulder. You are not defined by what others think of you, nor by how many people you can intimidate, Isaiah said softly. True power comes from knowing yourself and being comfortable with who you are. It takes far more courage to be kind than to be cruel. Kyle looked down, feeling the mixture of shame and gratitude. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, not with this kind of compassion and understanding. His friends, too, seemed lost in thought, their usual rowdiness replaced by a silence that carried the weight of reflection. Isaiah removed his hand, stepping back slightly to give them space. You have a choice, all of you. You can keep living the way you are, or you can start to see people as more than just targets for your anger and frustration. Respect is earned, not demanded. Derek cleared his throat, feeling the need to speak up, though he still felt hesitant. How do you know so much about this? He asked quietly. Isaiah smiled, his eyes softening with memories. Because I, too, was once like you, he admitted. I, too, was once a young man filled with anger, seeking to prove myself to the world. But someone taught me that there is more strength in understanding and forgiveness than in fighting every battle. And that lesson changed my life. The boys stood there, taking in Isaiah's words, their minds turning over thoughts they had never considered before. Kyle looked up, his voice barely a whisper. Can you teach us more about this? He asked, a hint of vulnerability in his tone. Isaiah's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with pride. I would be honored, he replied. But the journey starts within. Think on my words, and if you're truly ready to learn, I will teach you everything I know. The boys nodded, humbled and transformed in ways they couldn't yet understand. Isaiah's words had planted seeds of change, seeds that, in time, would grow into something far greater than the arrogance and bravado they had once worn like armor. As they walked away, they carried with them a new awareness, the first steps on a path of respect, self-discovery, and true strength. The first lesson. Days passed after the boys' encounter with Isaiah, and life in the small suburban town resumed its usual rhythm. But something had shifted in Kyle and his friends. They could no longer shake the encounter with the elderly man in the park, nor his words, which lingered in their minds like echoes. Each of them found themselves replaying his quiet, confident demeanor, his firm grip that had stilled Kyle's hand, and most of all, his unexpected kindness. For Kyle, especially, Isaiah's words had left a deep impression. Isaiah hadn't retaliated, hadn't shamed them, and hadn't succumbed to anger. He had shown a strength that Kyle didn't understand yet couldn't ignore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he wanted to know what gave Isaiah such calm control, such an unwavering sense of self. One afternoon, Kyle made up his mind. He texted his friends, asking them to meet him at the park. The other boys were skeptical at first, joking that Kyle had become obsessed with the old guy or that he'd lost his edge. But deep down, each of them felt a similar pull. Something about Isaiah had left an undeniable mark. They showed up at the park, their curiosity outweighing their reservations. Isaiah was there, sitting on his usual bench, reading as he always did. But this time, he wasn't surprised to see them. He looked up as they approached, offering a small smile as though he had known all along they would return. So, you're back, Isaiah said, closing his book gently. His eyes held a spark of warmth and amusement as he looked at each of them, sensing the shift in their attitudes. Kyle, feeling a bit out of his element, hesitated before speaking. We want to know more, About what you said the other day, he muttered, glancing nervously at his friends. Isaiah's smile grew, and he nodded in understanding. You've taken the first step already, he said. That step is humility, the willingness to learn. It's the foundation of all true strength. The boys exchanged uncertain glances, not quite understanding what he meant, but eager to listen nonetheless. They stood there in silence, waiting for Isaiah to continue. Isaiah rose from the bench and gestured for them to follow him. There's something I want to show you. It's not far. Intrigued, the boys trailed behind him, moving deeper into the park where the noise of the playground and the chatter of picnicking families faded into the background. After a short walk, they arrived at a secluded clearing where the grass grew wild, untouched by the park's landscapers. In the center of the clearing was a large, smooth rock, weathered by time but still solid and unyielding. Isaiah approached the rock, placing a hand on its cool surface. This rock, he said, has been here for decades, possibly even centuries. It has endured storms, scorching summers, freezing winters, and countless footsteps. Yet it remains, unchanging and steadfast. The boys looked at the rock, confused. They didn't see how a rock could have anything to do with what they were hoping to learn. Isaiah noticed their puzzled expressions and chuckled softly. The strength of this rock doesn't come from its ability to move or fight. Its strength lies in its endurance, its ability to withstand the elements without breaking or bending. Real strength, he said, turning to face them, is not about overpowering others. It's about resilience and inner stability. The boys listened, their curiosity piqued. Kyle, his arms crossed, couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. So you're saying we should just stand there and take it when someone pushes us around? Isaiah shook his head. No, Kyle. Strength isn't about letting others trample over you. It's about knowing when to stand firm and when to step aside. There are times when you must protect yourself or others. But how you respond, the intention behind your actions, that's what matters. Strength guided by ego leads to conflict. Strength guided by purpose leads to peace. Kyle looked down, mulling over Isaiah's words. They were the opposite of what he had always believed. For him, strength had meant being able to dominate others, to never show weakness. But Isaiah's perspective was different, challenging, and deeply compelling. The boys stood there in silence, the weight of Isaiah's words sinking in. Then Derek, who had been watching Isaiah intently, asked, How did you learn all of this? Isaiah's face softened, and his gaze drifted to the sky, as if recalling a memory from long ago. I had a teacher once, many years back, he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. He taught me that strength lies in self-control and understanding. In my youth, I was much like you, restless, eager to prove myself, ready to fight anyone who challenged me. But he showed me that the most important battles are fought within. The boys could see the respect Isaiah had for his teacher, even after all these years. They sensed that this teacher had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who commanded respect without needing to demand it. Isaiah turned to them, his gaze steady. If you truly want to understand strength, you must first understand yourselves. Only then can you make choices that align with your values rather than your insecurities. Kyle clenched his fists, feeling a strange mixture of frustration and admiration. But what if someone is trying to hurt you or someone you care about? He asked, the fire in his eyes revealing his inner conflict. Aren't you supposed to fight back? Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. Yes, there are times when you must defend yourself or others. But even then, how you choose to respond defines the kind of person you are. There is power in restraint, in knowing that you can cause harm but choosing not to. That choice, he continued, requires greater strength than any punch. Isaiah took a step back, observing the boys with a look of quiet pride. Would you be willing to practice this strength? He asked, his voice calm but filled with intention. The boys looked at each other, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to determination. Isaiah's words had resonated with them. challenging their previous beliefs and inspiring them to see strength in a new light. They nodded, each of them ready to learn, though they had no idea what lay ahead. Isaiah's eyes glinted with a hint of amusement. "Good," he said. "Then let's begin." Over the following days, Isaiah met the boys in the park, teaching them the basics of martial arts. But his lessons went far beyond physical techniques. With every punch, every stance, every form, he emphasized control, patience, and respect. He taught them to focus not just on their physical movements but on their state of mind, encouraging them to find balance between discipline and inner calm. One afternoon, as the boys practiced their stances, Isaiah approached Kyle. He had noticed that Kyle's movements were aggressive, filled with tension, as though he was still fighting an invisible opponent. "Kyle," Isaiah said gently, "you're holding back." Kyle froze, his face flushing. "What do you mean?" Isaiah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your movements are sharp, but there's anger in them. You're holding on to something that's keeping you from reaching your full potential." Kyle looked down, his jaw clenched. He had always prided himself on being tough, on never showing weakness. But here, with Isaiah's steady gaze on him, he felt an urge to open up. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I don't want to be weak. I don't want people to look down on me." Isaiah listened, his expression gentle. Strength isn't about hiding your fears or burying your emotions. True strength comes from facing them, acknowledging them, and then letting them go. Kyle took a deep breath, feeling a release he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, he felt the possibility of shedding the armor he had worn for so long. As the sun began to set, Isaiah gathered the boys around him. "Remember, strength isn't just about physical power. It's about courage, empathy, and understanding. The world will test you, but if you carry respect for yourselves and others, you'll find that true strength lies in compassion, not in conquest." The boys nodded, their faces reflecting a newfound determination. They had come to Isaiah seeking power, but they were leaving with something much greater, a sense of purpose, humility, and the beginnings of wisdom. As they left the park that evening, they walked a little taller, their hearts a little lighter. They had taken their first steps on a path toward becoming the kind of men they wanted to be, guided by Isaiah's teachings and the strength that came not from dominance, but from within. The trial of humility. A few weeks had passed since the boys began their training with Isaiah, and in that time, they had each begun to change in subtle yet significant ways. Their rough edges softened, replaced by an unusual calm. Their aggressive banter lessened, and they started treating each other with a respect that hadn't existed before. Even Kyle, the ringleader, found himself considering his words before speaking, as though Isaiah's lessons were taking root, growing into something meaningful. But for Isaiah, teaching them went beyond martial arts techniques or philosophical lessons. He knew that transformation required facing real-life challenges, not just practicing in a controlled environment. To truly understand humility, they would need to experience situations where their patience, self-control, and sense of dignity would be put to the test. Isaiah waited for the right opportunity, and eventually it presented itself. One sunny afternoon, Isaiah gathered the boys in their usual spot in the park. They had just finished practicing basic forms, their breaths coming in steady, controlled patterns. Isaiah watched them closely, sensing their progress and pride in their achievements. "Today," he said, his voice carrying a hint of seriousness, "I'm going to test what you've learned so far." The boys straightened, intrigued but nervous. They looked to one another, wondering what sort of trial Isaiah had in mind. Kyle was the first to speak up. "A test? Like a sparring match or something?" he asked, already picturing himself in a one-on-one with Isaiah, ready to prove his worth. Isaiah shook his head, a knowing smile on his lips. "No, not quite," he replied. "It will be a test of patience and humility, not strength." The boys' anticipation dimmed slightly. They had been hoping to demonstrate their physical prowess, to finally prove to Isaiah that they had learned well. But they trusted Isaiah, and the idea of a different kind of test piqued their curiosity. Isaiah led them out of the park and into the heart of town, where streets bustled with people going about their day. He directed them to a particular area, a spot they knew well, one that wasn't known for its friendliness. It was a neighborhood where people tended to mind their own business, where strangers weren't always welcomed kindly. Isaiah paused on the corner, turning to face the boys. "Today, I want you to walk down this street together," he said, his tone calm but unwavering. "You will encounter people who might not treat you kindly. Some may mock you or challenge you. Your task is to walk the length of this street without reacting to whatever they say or do. Simply walk, remain calm, and return here." The boys exchanged confused glances, their earlier enthusiasm fading into apprehension. They knew what he was asking of them. This particular street was notorious for its rough characters and occasional troublemakers. Walking down it without reacting to provocations would be no easy feat. Derek was the first to voice his concern. "So, we're just supposed to ignore them, even if they get in our faces?" Isaiah nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, you've spent weeks learning to control your strength, your emotions, and your actions. Today, you will practice restraint. Remember, your strength is not defined by how well you can fight, but by your ability to remain calm when others want to disrupt your peace." Kyle clenched his fists, feeling a pang of doubt. The street was infamous for its residents' tendency to single out strangers. He remembered being taunted there once as a kid, and it hadn't ended well. But he was determined to show Isaiah he could handle the challenge, even if every instinct in him screamed to respond to disrespect. Isaiah gave them a final, encouraging nod. "Trust yourselves. This is a lesson in humility and inner strength. I'll be here, waiting." The boys took a collective breath, steeling themselves, and set off down the street. Almost immediately, they felt the weight of suspicious gazes on them. People turned to look, sizing them up, a few muttering under their breath. The boys exchanged nervous glances, but they kept walking, shoulders squared and eyes forward. About halfway down the street, a group of men loitering outside a corner store noticed them and snickered. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his arms, called out, "Hey, what's with the tough guys? Look at these little soldiers on a mission." The men laughed, and one of them spat on the ground in front of the boys, a clear sign of disdain. Kyle felt a rush of anger bubbling inside him, his fists clenching reflexively. He was accustomed to reacting, to standing his ground when someone challenged him. But he remembered Isaiah's words, and with great effort, he kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. The burly man stepped closer, invading Kyle's space, his voice mocking. "What's the matter, kid? Got nothing to say? Thought you were some kind of hotshot." The man's voice dripped with taunting amusement as his friends chuckled in the background. Derek shot a glance at Kyle, sensing the tension radiating off him, but he gently placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, grounding him. Kyle took a deep breath, resisting the urge to lash out. He repeated Isaiah's words in his mind. True strength lies in restraint. It was a mantra he clung to as they walked past the men without a word, ignoring the jeers that followed them. Further down the street, an older woman sweeping her front steps paused, eyeing them suspiciously. "What are you boys doing here?" "Causing trouble, I'll bet," she muttered, her gaze sharp and untrusting. She shook her head in disapproval as they passed, and the boys could feel the judgment in her stare. "Not everyone will see you as you are," Isaiah had once said. "People judge what they don't understand. How you respond is a reflection of who you are, not of them." Repeating this, Kyle managed to keep his head high, ignoring the woman's judgment. Though he felt the sting of it, he could see it affected his friends too, each of them visibly trying to hold back their frustration. They finally reached the end of the street, their silence intact but their emotions raw. They regrouped, catching their breath, and exchanging looks of relief and exhaustion. It was a simple task on the surface, yet each of them felt as though they had crossed a battlefield. When they returned to Isaiah, He greeted them with a knowing smile, his eyes reflecting both pride and compassion. He could see the toll the trial had taken, but he knew they had learned something invaluable. "How did it feel?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Kyle let out a deep breath, his frustration finally surfacing. "It was hard. I wanted to say something, to fight back. It felt humiliating to just let them talk to us like that." Isaiah nodded, understanding the weight of Kyle's words. "Humility can often feel like humiliation at first," he said. "Our pride, our egos, they don't want to be quiet. But strength is not just about winning fights or proving yourself. It's about controlling that pride, even when others challenge it." The boys listened intently, Isaiah's words settling over them like a balm. He looked each of them in the eyes, seeing their struggle and resilience. "You may feel as though you lost something by not fighting back," he continued, "but what you gained is far greater. You learned that respect for yourself is not defined by others' words or actions. You can stand tall, secure in your own strength, even when others try to knock you down." Derek, who had been particularly affected by the test, spoke up, his voice reflective. "So, standing up for ourselves doesn't always mean fighting." Isaiah's eyes softened. "Exactly, Derek. True courage often means choosing not to fight when there's nothing to prove. You each showed restraint, a strength of character that few possess. When you walk through life with dignity, you need no one's validation but your own." The boys felt a sense of pride replacing their earlier frustration. They had expected strength to mean control over others, but Isaiah had shown them that true strength was about control over oneself. Isaiah smiled, sensing their growth. "This is only the beginning," he said. "Life will test you in many ways, and often the hardest test will be holding your peace when others provoke you. But remember, you have the power to define who you are, and that power lies within you alone." As they walked back to the park together, the boys felt a new understanding blooming within them. They had learned a lesson in humility, one that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength. And for the first time, they began to see the world through Isaiah's eyes, a world where dignity, restraint, and true inner strength could outshine any show of force. The lesson of compassion. Over the next few weeks, Isaiah continued his teachings, guiding the boys through not only the physical skills of martial arts, but also the mental and emotional discipline that accompanied true strength. They had faced their first trial with humility, learning that restraint was a vital part of strength. But Isaiah had another, more profound lesson waiting for them, one that would challenge their perceptions of themselves and others even further. One chilly autumn afternoon, Isaiah gathered the boys at the park as usual. They were practicing their forms with renewed discipline, their movements sharp and focused, a testament to how much they had grown under his guidance. Isaiah observed them, noting their progress, not just in skill, but in the way they carried themselves, with a newfound calmness and maturity. After their practice, Isaiah called them over. "Today, I want you to meet someone," he announced, his tone carrying an unusual seriousness. The boys exchanged curious glances, but followed without question. They had come to trust Isaiah deeply, understanding that each lesson he provided was building something valuable within them. He led them across town, and they soon arrived at a modest, run-down shelter nestled between older buildings. The faded sign above the door read, "Haven House Community Shelter." Isaiah pushed open the door, and the boys followed him inside. The shelter was a small, worn space filled with mismatched furniture, but it was warm, bustling with people from all walks of life. The air was thick with a mixture of scents, freshly cooked food, old books, and a faint hint of cleaning supplies. As they entered, a middle-aged woman approached them, her face lighting up with recognition when she saw Isaiah. "Isaiah, it's been too long," she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm hug. The boys watched with interest, sensing that there was a deeper connection between Isaiah and this place than they had known. "Boys, this is Ms. Eleanor," Isaiah introduced her. "She runs this shelter, providing meals and a safe space for those in need." Ms. Eleanor smiled warmly, greeting each of the boys in turn, her eyes radiating a kindness that put them at ease. Isaiah looked at the boys, his gaze steady. Today's lesson is different. I've brought you here to learn about compassion. Strength isn't only about defending yourself. It's about using what you have to uplift others. That's true power. The boys listened, unsure of what he meant but willing to follow his lead. Isaiah turned to Ms. Eleanor, who nodded, understanding without words. "We can always use an extra hand," she said with a grateful smile. "Come with me, boys." They followed her to the kitchen, where trays of food were being prepared. Ms. Eleanor handed each of them a task. Kyle and Derek were assigned to dish out soup, while the others helped carry trays to tables where people were waiting. Some of the shelter's guests were quiet, avoiding eye contact, while others exchanged smiles and polite greetings, clearly grateful for the warm meal. As they worked, the boys observed the people around them. An elderly man with weathered hands and a distant look in his eyes, a young mother struggling to keep her children in check, and a few teenagers not much older than themselves, huddled together, their eyes wary yet curious. It was a stark reminder that not everyone had the same privileges they did. Kyle, in particular, felt a strange discomfort as he ladled soup into bowls. He had never given much thought to the struggles of others outside his own circle. But now, standing here in this shelter, seeing people in need, he felt a twinge of guilt for all the times he mocked others without a second thought. These people had stories, lives, and struggles he couldn't begin to understand. After an hour, they finished serving the meal and took a moment to rest. The boys gathered around Isaiah, each of them quiet, processing the experience. "You see," Isaiah said softly, "compassion isn't just an emotion. It's a responsibility. When you have strength, whether physical, mental, or emotional, you have a duty to use it to help those who don't. Real strength lies in knowing you can make a difference, no matter how small." Kyle looked down at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I never thought about it like that. I always thought strength was about protecting myself. But here, these people, they need someone to protect them too." Isaiah nodded, his expression filled with a quiet pride. "Yes, Kyle. Not everyone has the resources or the support to stand up for themselves. That's why those who have strength must also have compassion. Without compassion, strength becomes hollow, serving only the ego." The boys sat in thoughtful silence, digesting Isaiah's words. Then, unexpectedly, a young man approached their table. He looked to be in his 20s, with a thin frame, scruffy clothes, and dark shadows under his eyes. He shifted nervously, his gaze flickering between Isaiah and the boys. "I heard you guys talking," he began hesitantly. You sound like you know what you're talking about. I don't usually talk to people, but it's been rough lately. Lost my job, got kicked out of my apartment, and I've been here a while now, just trying to get back on my feet." The boys looked at him, each of them struck by the openness in his words, the vulnerability he showed in admitting his struggles. Kyle, feeling an unusual urge to help, spoke up. "Is there anything we can do? Like, do you need clothes, or—" The man managed a faint smile. "Just someone to listen, maybe," he replied. "Most people just walk by and don't see me. But thanks. It means a lot." Isaiah watched the interaction with a sense of pride, seeing how the boys were beginning to understand the essence of compassion. He could see their expressions shift as they realized that offering strength wasn't always about physical assistance. Sometimes it was as simple as acknowledging someone's existence, making them feel seen and heard. As they left the shelter that evening, the boys walked with a newfound weight to their steps, the reality of their experience settling over them. They had spent so much time proving their strength to themselves and each other, yet here, in this small shelter, they had come to understand that strength could be quiet, gentle, and profoundly impactful. On the walk back to the park, Derek broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. "I didn't realize how much I take for granted," he admitted. "I complain about little things, when there are people who don't even know where they're sleeping at night. The others nodded, echoing his sentiment, each of them reflecting on how their perspectives had shifted in just one afternoon. Isaiah placed a reassuring hand on Derek's shoulder. The world is full of unseen battles, Derek. The strongest among us are often the ones who face hardship with grace, even when no one else sees it. Compassion is what connects us, what makes us human. As they reached the park, Isaiah gathered them around, his expression warm yet serious. What you've seen today is only a glimpse of what compassion means. True strength requires empathy, the ability to put yourself in another's shoes and use your power for good. Remember, no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Kyle looked at Isaiah, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. I want to keep helping, Isaiah, he said firmly. Not just here, but everywhere. I want to be the kind of person who uses what I've learned to actually make a difference. Isaiah's smile was one of deep satisfaction. Then you are beginning to understand, Kyle. The journey to true strength doesn't end with personal achievements. It continues in how you uplift others, how you show kindness to strangers, and how you use your power to create a better world. The boys nodded, each of them feeling a profound shift in their sense of purpose. Their time with Isaiah had transformed them, challenging their beliefs about strength and teaching them that compassion was a cornerstone of true character. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, the boys knew that they had taken another step on their journey, a journey that was no longer about proving themselves, but about becoming men of integrity, empathy, and unwavering strength. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, that real strength was not just about power or control, but about compassion, the courage to help others, and the humility to serve, the final test of honor. The weeks that followed were transformative for Kyle and his friends. Isaiah's lessons had woven themselves into the fabric of their lives, shifting their actions and attitudes in ways they hadn't anticipated. The boys no longer looked for conflicts, nor did they feel the same need to assert dominance. They had learned the deeper meaning of strength and the quiet power of compassion. One afternoon, Isaiah gathered them at their usual spot in the park, the same bench where they had first met him. This time, though, there was a sense of finality in his demeanor, as though he had reached the final chapter of his teaching. You've come a long way, Isaiah began, his gaze proud yet contemplative. Each of you has shown resilience, humility, and empathy. But to complete this journey, there's one last lesson to learn, the lesson of honor. The boys listened intently, sensing the gravity of his words. Isaiah's eyes lingered on each of them, his expression warm but firm. Honor, he continued, is the foundation upon which all strength and compassion rest. It is the commitment to uphold your values, even when no one is watching, even when the stakes are high. Today, I'm going to give you an opportunity to test this honor. The boys exchanged glances, intrigued and slightly anxious. What could he mean by a test of honor? Isaiah gestured for them to follow, and they walked together through town, eventually arriving at a neighborhood they knew well. It was a part of town they used to frequent, but for all the wrong reasons. Here, they had once found trouble, picking on others, trying to prove their strength. The boys felt a pang of discomfort as memories of their past behavior resurfaced. Isaiah stopped in front of a rundown apartment building and turned to face them. Today's test is one of action, not words, he said. Inside this building lives a man named Mr. Leroy. He's elderly, frail, and doesn't have much family left. He spends his days alone, and his health has been deteriorating. The neighbors say he needs help, but pride keeps him from asking for it. The boys nodded, feeling a sense of empathy. They understood now that pride, while powerful, could also be a barrier. What I ask of you, Isaiah continued, is to help him, but on his terms. He may not thank you, he may not even acknowledge what you're doing, but your task is to serve without expectation, to offer your strength purely for the sake of doing what's right. This is honor. The boys agreed, and as they approached Mr. Leroy's apartment, Isaiah stepped back, letting them handle the task themselves. Kyle led the way, knocking on the door gently. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with a worn face and a stubborn set to his jaw. His clothes were faded, and his eyes held a mix of pride and resignation. "What do you want?" Mr. Leroy asked, his voice gruff but weakened by age. Kyle cleared his throat, speaking carefully. "Hello, sir. We're here to see if you need any help around your apartment. Anything we can do for you." Mr. Leroy's gaze hardened, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "I don't need charity from a bunch of boys. I've managed just fine on my own all these years." Kyle felt a surge of doubt, wondering if they should just leave. But he remembered Isaiah's words. Help without expectation. This was about doing the right thing, not about seeking gratitude. "We understand, sir," Kyle replied gently. "But we're not here out of charity. We're here because we want to help. Think of us as extra hands, if you need them." Mr. Leroy stared at them for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he grumbled, "If you're so eager to be useful, then fine. I need help moving a few boxes in the storage room. But don't think I'll be paying you or anything." The boys exchanged relieved glances and nodded, following Mr. Leroy inside. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with relics of the past, framed photos, old books, and a variety of trinkets that hinted at a rich life, now quiet and solitary. They followed him into the cramped storage room, where several boxes were stacked haphazardly. Without hesitation, they got to work, lifting and organizing the boxes as Mr. Leroy watched, his gaze growing softer as he saw their willingness to help. As they worked, Kyle noticed a faded photo frame lying on top of one of the boxes. It was a picture of Mr. Leroy in his youth, standing proudly in a military uniform, surrounded by fellow soldiers. The sight filled him with respect. This man, once strong and proud, had served his country and was now alone, navigating life's final chapters with the remnants of his pride. "Thank you," Mr. Leroy said abruptly, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't like asking for help. Never did." Derek, feeling a surge of empathy, spoke up. "We're glad to help, Mr. Leroy. It's the least we can do." The boys spent the next few hours helping him around the apartment, organizing his things, fixing a leaky faucet, and even sweeping up dust. They didn't ask for anything in return. Their satisfaction came from seeing Mr. Leroy's quiet gratitude, his reluctance softening into acceptance. By the time they were finished, Mr. Leroy had grown more comfortable with their presence, even sharing a few stories from his past. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Leroy held out a trembling hand. "You boys, you've got good hearts," he said gruffly. "Not many people would do what you did today. You've shown me there's still honor in this world." The boys accepted his words with humble nods, the depth of his gratitude making them realize how far they had come since meeting Isaiah. They no longer sought validation or acknowledgement. Simply knowing they had made a difference was enough. They reunited with Isaiah outside, who greeted them with a proud smile. "How did it go?" he asked, though his eyes already held the answer. Kyle spoke up, his voice filled with sincerity. "We helped him, just like you said. And it felt different, Isaiah. This wasn't about proving anything. It was just the right thing to do." Isaiah placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that, Kyle, is the lesson of honor. When you act without expectation, when you offer your strength without seeking anything in return, you embody true strength. You become men of honor." The boys nodded, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and understanding. They had come to Isaiah seeking power, validation, and respect. But what they had found was infinitely more valuable. A deep-seated sense of honor and a purpose that transcended ego or bravado. As they walked back to the park, Isaiah spoke one final lesson, his words weaving themselves into the fabric of their beings. "Honor will guide you when pride tempts you, when anger challenges you, and when the world seems against you. It will be the compass that points you to the right path, even when that path is difficult." And it will remind you that the strongest man is not the one who conquers others, but the one who conquers himself. The boys absorbed this wisdom, each of them knowing that their lives had been irrevocably changed by Isaiah's teachings. They had learned not only to harness their strength, but to direct it with humility, empathy, and an unwavering sense of duty to others. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, the boys realized that their journey with Isaiah had come full circle. They had started as young men filled with arrogance and a thirst for power, and now they stood as individuals filled with honor, purpose, and compassion. Isaiah, sensing their transformation, gave them a final nod of approval. "You've learned all I have to teach. The rest of the journey is yours to walk." With that, he left them standing in the golden light of the setting sun, knowing that he had imparted something invaluable. They watched him go, feeling both a sense of gratitude and a solemn commitment to carry forward the lessons he had taught them. From that day forward, they walked a new path, one guided by the strength of character and the quiet dignity that Isaiah had instilled in them. They knew that life would challenge them, but they were ready, fortified by honor and the understanding that true strength was not in the hands but in the heart. In their final moments together, they made a silent promise to uphold the values they had learned, to be a source of light and strength in the lives of others. And as they left the park, each step felt like a pledge, a commitment to a life of integrity, compassion, and, above all, honor.